Ishiro Honda once said that the tragedy of monsters is the fact that they are born too tall, too strong, and too heavy. And at least in the context of the films, he was right. These attributes have led to Godzilla having many disagreements with the Japanese military. But at least in the context of pop culture, these attributes have led to the opposite for Godzilla. They've allowed him to prosper and produce 28 movies. But I want to analyze this and discover what it truly is about Godzilla that attracts people to him and why he's been so endearing. And the only way to truly do that successfully is to review every Godzilla movie ever made.
Some people might be angry, but regardless, welcome to Zazubaar's Godzilla Palooza. Greetings, mutated sea lice. I am Zazubaar, and welcome back to Godzilla Palooza. It's day 17, and today, with the Showa series finally behind us, we are going to get into the second Godzilla series, the series that reboots itself back to the original, with the original being the only film that actually happened, with the 1984 reboot Godzilla, otherwise more commonly known as The Return of Godzilla. Yes, in Japan this film was simply released as Godzilla. Internationally, Toho said, no, it's called The Return of Godzilla, but in Japan they just released it as Godzilla, with direct translation, but overall Toho does refer to the film as The Return of Godzilla. So The Return of Godzilla is a 1984 reboot to the entire franchise of Godzilla, starting with the original and then continuing on from that point, taking place still 30 years later though. But it ignores everything from Raids Again to Terror of Mechagodzilla. And just starts over from the original. The big reason why no more Godzilla films were made after Terror of Mechagodzilla, and why this is a reboot 9 years later, is the fact that Terror of Mechagodzilla, despite being a fantastic film, was a flop over there in Japan. The big reason for that was the fact that the film had such a big budget, but had a decidedly terrible box office reception. It was a total flop. And the big reason for that was because Japan was going through an oil crisis at the time, and the Japanese film industry and the Japanese economy really overall was just in total shambles. So no one was really going to see movies, so Terror of Mechagodzilla suffered from it. And despite Toho and Henry G. Saperstein's plans to continue producing Godzilla films up until the 80s, they just couldn't do it. They just didn't think it was going to be financially sound to do it. So they just decided to end the franchise. I'm supposing that was after the film was made, but again, that last shot with Godzilla somewhat, sadly, but somewhat epically returns to the sea with that very dramatic music that plays. And it's strange that was there if that wasn't intended to be the end, but whatever. So that was really the end of the franchise. But in 1984, with Tomoyuki Tanaka's desire to bring the franchise back, because the Japanese film industry was kind of booming again, and it was decidedly a better idea to bring Godzilla back, they decided, hey, let's bring the guy back. But they decided not to do another sequel because Tanaka wanted to take Godzilla back to its roots, and he thought that would be the best financial way to do it, would be to totally forget everything that happened in the Showa series and just start over. This may in fact be the first movie reboot ever. I'm not sure on that, but it might be the first film that reboots completely from a whole other franchise, but I'm not sure on that. I could very well be wrong, but it's one of the first. since now the whole idea these days is to reboot every single franchise ever. So Godzilla 84 is definitely commendable and unique for that. So it takes it back to the original, and Tanaka wanted to take Godzilla back to his dark roots. He didn't want to do any more campy superhero Godzilla films. Also with some pressure by Ishiro Honda, or not pressure, but some feedback from Ishiro Honda to do that as well. Ishiro Honda was actually offered to direct this film, but he didn't want to do it for two reasons. One, he couldn't do it because his schedule was filled up when he was helping his friend Akira Kurosawa, I mentioned this last time, direct some new Kurosawa films that were kind of comeback films for him as well. And Honda was co-directing them or being creative consultants, as he was so dubiously marked on the films. So Honda didn't want to do it for that reason, or he couldn't do it for that reason. But he wouldn't have done it anyway if he had the opportunity to, because he didn't think the Godzilla franchise should have continued after 1970 anyway, since that was the passing of E.G. Sabraya, who was, in a way, the founder of Godzilla, and that he created the suit, and he was kind of the thing that made Godzilla what he was. So he thought that it would be he didn't think it was, right to do anymore after that. Like, that was just kind of, we should lay it to rest after that without him around. Tanaka, of course, disagreed, so that we had the later Showa series. And Honda did come back for Terror of Mechagodzilla, though. But with 84, he was still kind of like, let's just not do anymore. I suppose with the 9-year gap adding to that as well. Also, he thought that the way the franchise went in the 70s, that was a result of Sabraya not being there. So he didn't want to do it for that either. Like, he thought that this was going to be another superhero film. But it wasn't, of course. But so he was offered, but he declined. So for better or worse, Honda is not involved. However, 84, despite Honda's concerns and despite probably audiences' interpretation of Godzilla at that point, certainly in America at least, Godzilla was given a new dark film that totally forgot about all that superhero stuff, and now it's a dark, gritty, nuclear metaphor film with Godzilla as the villain destroying cities again. Which was something I'm sure a lot of people forgot even happened, because this is, of course, the 30th anniversary of Godzilla, which was also why this movie was made when it was, because it was the 30th anniversary of Godzilla. So it was made for that as well. So that's really all the background I wanted to get into about the return of Godzilla. The last thing I want to say is that, about the background before I get into the plot and details, is that this is a great movie, but it's not... Despite being great, and despite having really nothing I can pick out and say, yeah, that's a bad thing about it, it's slightly forgetful, or forgettable, I suppose is the way I should put it. And I think the big reason for that is, despite being a film that takes Godzilla back to his dark roots, and takes the franchise back to a much more serious tone like it had in 54, it's somewhat forgettable because, despite all that darkness and all the stuff that was in the original Gojira, it's a little bit too mainstream to be Godzilla. And I know some of you are going to disagree out there, but mainly the Japanese cut, the English cut as well, but both cuts feel a little bit too mainstream to really feel like a tried and true Godzilla movie. Like, there's a little bit too much 80s in them. Right now we're going to be reviewing the original Japanese cut, The Return of Godzilla, which I actually just watched for the first time today. And in the next part, we're going to do another two-parter today, and in the next part, we're going to talk about Godzilla 1985, the American version. That should be a very short review, but this one might be a little long, so again, I apologize in advance. But I just wanted to say that, yeah, I do really like this movie, but I think the biggest thing that kind of holds it back for me on it being amazing and deserving a 5 out of 5 is the fact that it is a little bit too mainstream, and that kind of dampens it a little bit. It doesn't ruin the movie at all, but it does repulse me away just a tad. But it doesn't ruin the movie at all. This is still a fantastic movie. So with all that said, let's get into the plot of The Return of Godzilla. The plot goes a little something like this. Overall, you're going to notice it's very similar to the original Gojira, just with some 80s twists to it. So basically it goes like this. There is a fishing boat in the South Pacific that is caught in a typhoon, and when they're out trying to deal with this typhoon, there is in fact an entire island that gets ripped out of the sea and rises up that terrifies the entire crew, and we hear an ominous roar that comes from the island. The next day, after the boat is seemingly, well, we don't see it happen, but basically the boat just seems to be adrift when a young news reporter named Maki Goro, yes, it's the same name as the guy from Son of Godzilla, comes upon the boat, which is seemingly abandoned. He goes on the boat and does a little investigating and discovers that everyone on board is dead, totally drained of blood, except for one person whose name is Okamaru. Or Okamura? Okamura. And before he's able to get Okamura off the ship, a giant sea louse attacks him. And presumably this is the thing that did this to the entire crew. Okamura kills it, and they go back to Maki's boat, where Okamura tells him the story about this monster that he saw rise out of the sea that scared the crap out of the people on his boat and ultimately led to their predicament. Now note, the monster did not destroy the boat. He simply saw the creature. It did nothing to him. The explanation is that the entire crew was not killed by the thing that we're going to learn to be Godzilla, but was in fact killed by parasites from Godzilla called, these giant sea lice. And because of Godzilla's immense radiation, these sea lice got over like 5 times the normal size and were able to kill people. So that's why the boat was in the condition it is. I really like that twist. It may seem a little bit strange to be in a Godzilla film, but it's ultimately very interesting and cool. But anyway, back to the plot. So basically, this Okamura's report leads to some inquiries by the Japanese government, who keep Okamura in a police hospital while he's recuperating from this incident, and keep an entire public and news blackout on Okamura. And because of this, Maki can't print the story about him and his crew. Okamura apparently has a sister, and this sister goes to the college in Tokyo University, where a professor named Hayashida works. And Hayashida appears earlier in the film as one of the people who goes into ask Okamura some questions about what he saw. And Maki goes to see him to see if he knows anything about Godzilla, because he finds out it's Godzilla very early on, since he wants to be able to print the story, but he doesn't know why. So he asks his editor, and his editor simply says, "It's Godzilla, you can't print the story because it's going to throw the nation into panic." So he goes to Hayashida looking for a little bit of background on Godzilla, and Hayashida reveals that back in 1954, his parents were in fact in Tokyo. Well, they were, of course, they lived there, but his parents were murdered in Godzilla's original attack on Tokyo, and Hayashida was left a very bitter man, to quote Maki from the American version. And this event drove him to study nuclear biology and try to come up with a way to kill Godzilla, despite already being killed, just to kind of learn what Godzilla is, why his parents died, all that stuff. So that's why he became a scientist. After this, Okamura's sister, Naoko, discovers from Maki that Okamura is in the hospital and still alive, and she busts through police barriers to go see him. So that's when a little bit of the press blackout is lifted, in that Maki starts to take some pictures and starts to reveal the story. After this, however, the press blackout would no longer be able to work anyway, because a Russian submarine has been sunk by something believed to be an American sub. However, a Japanese reconnaissance plane takes some photos of the area after the crash, and underwater there is something that looks surprisingly familiar. It is the outline of Godzilla. So that's all the information that the Japanese government needs to issue a press conference saying Godzilla has returned. And this, of course, does throw the nation into panic, and throws the political world into panic. The Russians want permission to bomb the crap out of Godzilla for revenge or retaliation for what he did to their sub, and the Americans agree with them, saying, "You must let us use nuclear weapons on Godzilla, so that way it can be killed and not attack America." But Japan, of course, being Japan, declines and says 2 things. One, we're not letting no nukes being used in our country, because remember 44. So the Prime Minister declines for that reason. But the other reason, well, presumably they don't say this in the film, but I always took it this way, is that, do you guys know what Godzilla is? He's a living nuclear weapon. That's not going to work. It might even make him stronger. So they decline to use nuclear weapons. This all culminates in Godzilla returning to Japan and attacking a nuclear power plant. And Hayashida speculates that the reason why he does this, well, he doesn't speculate, he sees Godzilla do it. He sees that the reason why Godzilla attacks the power plant is to absorb nuclear energy and feed off of it, and he needs that as food. After Godzilla attacks the plant and absorbs all the atomic radiation, he leaves not because he's full or anything like that. He leaves because a flock of birds starts to go towards the beach, and Godzilla follows them for some reason, and Hayashida is left extremely raising an eyebrow at this. After doing a little research, he realizes that Godzilla, like most birds and dinosaurs, because they evolved from birds, or birds evolved from dinosaurs, that Godzilla, like all dinosaurs, has a certain way of navigating, which is basically his navigation depends on the magnetic poles. So the birds chirping caused Godzilla to follow them because something in his brain triggered, and he said, "Oh, I gotta go that way. There's something that I gotta see." So that's why Godzilla left. So Hayashida comes up with an idea to potentially save Japan from Godzilla by using the frequency of bird chirping, which is also kind of a magnetic frequency, to attract Godzilla to an island called Oshima Island, I believe is the name. Yes, Oshima Island, where there's a volcano called Mount Mahara, which a scientist friend of his has discovered that it's about to erupt. So Hayashida comes up with the plan to attract Godzilla there using these bird sounds, and his scientist friend will cause a controlled eruption that will lock Godzilla inside this volcano, where he can be held prisoner. The Japanese government is a little bit apprehensive about this plan. They're not sure if it's going to work, and it sounds a little out there, but Hayashida and his scientist friend do convince them to at least give him a try. In the meantime, though, they say, okay, we need other options because this is going to take a little while. So the other option is that the Japanese military has been creating this weapon called the Super X, which is this flying aircraft that was designed to defend the capital in case of an invasion, an invasion by another country. And it's totally impervious to nuclear weapons, just in case, Japan ever got hit by a nuke, they could defend the capital with it. So the Super X is also still under construction, so in the meantime, they're just kind of praying that Godzilla won't attack. But of course he does. He invades Tokyo later that, I guess a week. They don't really show any specific time span, but he attacks soon after that and invades Tokyo. The military does everything in their power to try and stop him. Nothing works. But in the meantime, however, while all this is going on, we discover that the Russians have planted a freighter inside Tokyo Bay containing a launch station or a connection station that will allow them to press a button that will launch a nuclear missile from space to hit Godzilla. And the Americans actually have the same thing, but the Russians are the only ones who actually have a freighter there to actually do this. We don't see an American one, but I guess we can presume it's there. Anyway, so during Godzilla's attack, however, he steps on this boat, triggering it to launch the nuke. So now there's a nuke coming in Tokyo that causes another problem. The Japanese decide, in order to stop the nuke, or at least stop it from destroying Tokyo, they decide to call the Americans to launch a counter missile that will blow up the nuke in space. So that way, at least it doesn't cause catastrophic damage. All they'll get is fallout, which isn't the worst thing in the world. It's better than a fucking crater. So in the meantime, though, the Super X is finally ready and is deployed against Godzilla and does actually work in a way. He is neutralized by the cadmium missiles installed inside the Super X. So the Super X knocks Godzilla out, not kills him, but they do neutralize him. and he is now asleep while in the midst of destruction of Tokyo. And and in the meantime, this nuke is coming at Tokyo. However, the American missile does blow up the Russian missile. However, Godzilla, it's not determined how long Godzilla would have stayed neutralized, but I presume we can expect it to be longer than what it is. Because of the nuclear explosion over Tokyo, the fallout energizes Godzilla and gives him enough power to wake up, and he continues on his destruction of Tokyo and just totally levels the city and destroys the Super X. So now there's nothing except Dr. Hayashida's plan to stop Godzilla. So after Godzilla has totally devastated Tokyo, there's nothing left. Godzilla is attracted to Oshima Island by the bird calls. It's finally ready, and he is locked in the crater, and the humans are left to lament the events of the film, and Godzilla is contained once more but not killed for now. So that's really the plot of The Return of Godzilla. So as I said, it is quite similar to the original. It's got a very similar kind of progression. We've got mysterious incidents that all smell of Godzilla, but they're not said yet. There's some political debates and human drama. Godzilla has a small initial attack, and then he has a big wide attack, and different ways are come up to try and kill him, but none of them work. Again, there's all this little tiny twists where all these things could have been. And I'm not saying that The Return of Godzilla is predictable because of this. It's not, because of all these twists. But it does feel very similar in a good way to the original Gojira, and is ultimately very it's similar enough to Gojira where that's a good thing, but it's also different enough from it where it doesn't feel like a rehash. It's it's just a very similar structure and a little bit of an homage to the original Gojira. And overall, it's kind of like a twist on the original Gojira story in the 80s, and that's very interesting. So it's not a remake, it's a sequel, and overall the plot is great. Just very similar. But again, that's a good thing. It allows for some twists and some turns and some political debates. So I really like that, especially with this being a different time period. I think if it was the same time period, it wouldn't work at all, but it's not, so it works great. So the other reason why this plot is so good is that it's very simple yet it's very engaging. There's a lot of mysterious build-up to Godzilla's first appearance and some really epic moments. Like, one of my favorite moments in the story is when, right after being rescued by Maki, Okamura is looking at some photos that we don't see given to him by Hayashida, and he's looking at them very dramatically. And then he just stops on one and stares at it. And then we cut to Hayashida's face, he looks very solemn, and then we cut to Okamura's face, he looks terrified, and we look down at the picture. It's a picture taken in 1954 of Godzilla destroying Tokyo. And overall, just the build-up to Godzilla is just so cool. Just all the people talking about him and all the apprehensiveness over his potential return, it's just all great. Despite that, though, the only problem I have with the plot is that because it's so simple, there isn't really a lot else going on in the plot. There's enough, I guess, interesting to keep you engaged in the story. The only problem I have is that once Godzilla attacks the first time, we lose a lot of those interesting aspects. And it does start to become a very plot-driven film. And the problem with that is that it's a very simple film. So if it's plot-driven, there's not a lot driving it. And some of the scenes do feel a little, I don't want to say draggy, but they just, without a driving force, you start to get a little antsy watching the movie. And once Godzilla attacks the second time, that's not really the case, but at points, it just feels like there's not a driving force. And without a driving force, you don't feel like, you don't know if you don't know kind of what to expect. I don't want to say you know the ending. I just think you want, as an audience, you want to kind of know where this is going, otherwise you're not going to be as engaged. So I feel like there are points during Godzilla's second attack scene that are a little bit that way, but they're not really a problem. They get a little bit more, they pick up definitely after he gets reawakened by the nuclear fallout. After that, the film picks up drastically and is very interesting. So despite that, though, the plot is great. Fantastic atmosphere. I love all the political stuff. I love all the debates between Russia, America, and Japan. and I love all the intrigue about Russia blaming America for the sinking of the sub. So I love all that about it, and again, it's simple, but it allows for all these details, and allows for a lot of depth into these details, especially all the Cold War stuff, which we'll get back into when we talk about the theme. So otherwise, though, the plot is fantastic. I love the dark tone that's established very early on, and again, it adds to this film having quite a scary atmosphere. It's not horrifying, but it's definitely dark. It's no Godzilla versus Megalon. So it has quite a dark tone. Let's talk about the human cast. I like all of them, especially the Prime Minister of Japan and Hayashida. But despite being interesting and they definitely do come to life, they're not entirely memorable. And since a lot, I talked about this kind of with Terror of Mechagodzilla, since they don't have any humor about them. Nothing, I'm not saying jokes, just nothing personable about them, really. It leads to them not really having a personality. Maki gets one a little bit, but that's only because he's our protagonist. And I feel like without that, the rest of the cast is a little, I don't want to say stale, but a little forgettable. And not entirely, not entirely memorable. So I feel like despite Godzilla films needing a serious tone, you need to have something about your characters that makes them a little, I don't want to say quirky, but a little bit more, you need to give them a personality, and the best way to do that is through a little bit of humor. And a little bit of things that aren't about the plot necessarily. You need some scenes that bring your characters to life. And the two that get that the most for me is Hayashida and the Japanese Prime Minister. I love the Prime Minister. He's so solemn and so relatable in that you really feel the strain on this guy of all these international problems. He feels the weight of Russia, this being kind of his fault that Russia is about to declare nuclear war on America. He feels like it's his fault that, he doesn't feel like it's his fault, but he has a lot of pressure on him to make a decision on whether or not they can use nuclear weapons against Godzilla. And all his lines make him very, very relatable, a very solemn individual, and just very, you connect with him. And you really sympathize with him on a level of, oh my god, I would never want to be the Japanese Prime Minister. God bless you for doing it, man. And he's a really awesome character for that. So I really like him. He has a lot of screen time in the first act, which I really like. In the second and third act, he starts to get a little... Once Godzilla starts to take center stage, he starts to have a little less screen time, but he's still quite likable and very, very memorable. He's easily... This isn't really saying much, but I really like him. But he's the best Japanese Prime Minister of all the Godzilla films. Not that he has much competition, but it's good in that book. So I really like him as a character. My second character that I really like, and I definitely like him more, is Hayashida. I love Hayashida because he's got that connection to Godzilla that you so desperately need in a dark Godzilla film. He's got that hatred of this thing. Okamura has hatred for him as well, but it's not as strong and not as interesting as Hayashida's. Okamura has a recent and not very developed hatred of Godzilla, in that because indirectly Godzilla killed his entire crew. Really, Godzilla didn't even directly kill them. What did he do? He rose up out of the sea, and the parasites that were on him just killed his crew. So, sure, it's Godzilla's fault, but it's not direct, so it's not as powerful. Hayashida's is very direct and extremely powerful, and it's made more interesting because he's not a typical revenge-driven character. Hayashida's parents were killed by Godzilla 30 years ago. That's a long time ago. And as you would expect, he's slightly moved on. You can't base your entire life on revenge. And he's a very clear representation of that. When Maki meets him for the first time, he's a very broken man. Very little liveliness about him, extremely solemn, never cracks a smile, and is just extremely broken. and seemingly despairing of our world. He talks a lot, well, not a lot, but he clearly shows disdain for the world politics and the Cold War, and not in a preachy way. Like, he doesn't say, oh, I hate the Cold War, oh, I hate Russia. You just get that sense about him in the way he talks about Godzilla's origins. And that's how it should be. It shouldn't be in your face. It should be like this. It should be a character talking about, the main situation of the film, Godzilla. But you clearly see it in his face in the way he talks about how Godzilla is a living nuclear weapon, that he doesn't like the Cold War. So I like that about him. But the thing that makes him truly interesting for me is the fact that, not that he shows disdain for the Cold War, because really all the main characters in the film show disdain for the Cold War. The thing that makes him interesting for me is what he does for a living. Okay, so let's break down Hayashida. His parents are killed by Godzilla when he's presumably just a child. We don't get his age in the film, but since this is 30 years later, he might actually have been a child when his parents were killed. He could have been like 20 years old. Maybe he was that character who Kenji Sahara played in the original Gojira. That guy with the cigarette in his mouth drinking at the table? No. But who knows? He could have been 20 years old, because, he doesn't look terribly old, but he could be about 50. 50 is not terribly old, so maybe he was 20 back when the original Gojira was, happening. But whatever, it's not really important. But basically, his loved ones were taken from him by Godzilla. And he says, yeah, at first I wanted to kill the damn thing, so I became a scientist because I knew that was the only way to kill it. Another really interesting thing, because you'd think, oh, you'd become a military person so that way you could go out and fight Godzilla. No, he was a little bit more crafty about it. He said the only way you can kill Godzilla is with science. Well, he doesn't say that, but that's that's the sense you get. And that's obviously his reasoning, because otherwise, if you were going to be more direct about it, you'd become a military person. That's presumably why Major Tachibana from GMK becomes a military general. But whatever. Back to Hayashida. So I really love Hayashida for that, because he becomes this scientist to take revenge on Godzilla. But that was 30 years ago. So, Godzilla's presumably dead. What does he have to work with? All he can do is try to teach others what he learned from his experience with Godzilla, that, we have to change. We can't create more monsters like Godzilla. And that's the dialogue that he supports in the scene where he talks about his backstory. In that, so that's what he's kind of become, in that, he can't keep trying to make weapons that'll kill him because he's dead already. So all he can even hope to do is, prevent another Godzilla from being born, and that's what he's doing now. And that's why he's a very calm man. So I really like that about him. He's very interesting, easily my favorite human character in the film, and I absolutely love him. So that's Hayashida, favorite character in the film. Very, very interesting. So with that said about the humans, again, they're interesting but not entirely memorable. So with all that said about the humans, let's get into the only monster in the film for once in a long time. Let's talk about Godzilla. Godzilla in this film is a throwback to 54, in that now he's back to this unemotional, badass, villainous destroyer. This unmerciful, destructive force who goes into Tokyo and annihilates it. We have not had a Godzilla like this in 30 years. It's just a treat to see Godzilla tear apart Tokyo and not have to fight another monster. Sure, we're going to get other scenes of Godzilla destroying cities in the next couple films, and in the next, series, but it's never going to be anything like this again. I mean, Godzilla just totally tears apart Tokyo, and there's a focus on it. And because of the updated special effects, because of this darker tone, it's absolutely spectacular. And overall, this is actually one of the few times in the series where I'm going to legitimately say Godzilla is frightening. I mean, sure, he's been a badass, and he's been, I don't want to say terrifying, but he's terrified others. He comes off as legitimately threatening, and, well, not threatening, legitimately scary in The Return of Godzilla. Like, he is legitimately, you don't want to be around him. I don't get that sense with a lot of Godzilla films. I mean, I always get the threatening badass, but never scary. And I think that's just the way that he's characterized in this film, that all the characters react to him in a scared way, and ultimately the realistic special effects in this film also add to that, and the atmosphere as well adds to that. So very well done on Godzilla's characterization. It's very much so a throwback to 254. I think he's very well done, and he's fantastic. So I love Godzilla in this film. So let's talk about the theme and allegory of The Return of Godzilla. The Return of Godzilla is, again, it's a little bit of a throwback to 54, but more than that, you know, as I said with my review of the original Gojira, I said that it was an exploration of modern Japan, an exploration of post-World War II Japan. It was talking about the atomic allegory, it's about the relationships of Japan at the time, and just about the society in general. Godzilla 84, or The Return of Godzilla, does that a little bit. It's not as comprehensive as Gojira is. Really, the big thing that is covered and covered well is the politics of the time. It's about the Cold War, and that's very pronounced in the film and ultimately worked great into the plot. It just seems very natural for all these Cold War scenes to be occurring with Godzilla's return. So I think the film is definitely an exploration of, all right, so what would happen if Godzilla appeared once more in 1984? What would be different? What would be the reaction? It's very realistic and very interesting for that. One of my favorite aspects of the film is the way the world reacts, the political debates, the military reaction, all the characters' reactions. It's all fantastic and quite comprehensive. And it's especially the political stuff. The political debates are so well written and so interesting, and the Prime Minister is a sympathetic and interesting individual. So the politics of the film are definitely the strongest aspect and ultimately the most explored. I think ultimately the main message of what Godzilla does to the world is that him being an embodiment of nuclear weapons, he causes a really manic reaction. I love when the Prime Minister talks about as soon as we've got the force that might destroy us, you will compromise your principles and want to launch nuclear weapons at him and kill innocent people. And he kind of goes against that. So I really like that line because it's kind of like, we pretend to have a civilized society, yet we're pointing nukes at each other, and at the drop of a hat, we might just all out destroy each other and just totally destroy the world. Over what? It's very disdainful of the Cold War and very much so negatively portrays America and Russia. Not individually, neither one of them is singled out as bad. The conflict itself is presented as negative. It's not the cultures, it's not the societies, it's just their conflict. Because what are they truly fighting over is the ultimate question. It's just the fact that they have them. So I like how that's equally and negatively portrayed. In the American cut, it's not. We'll get to that in the next review. But I like the political stuff. I think it's interesting, and I think that it's quite comprehensive. And ultimately, I think Godzilla is just representative of the way the world would react if we actually went into nuclear war. We all drop our principles at the drop of a hat, and just try to, save ourselves. The problem with Return of Godzilla is that it definitely wants to have these themes of the original Gojira. It's very apparent with the way it's told. The problem is that it's not as comprehensive. You feel like it points the plot. It's almost the reverse problem from what I had with Godzilla vs. Hedorah, where that film had more allegory than plot. I feel like this film has more plot than allegory. And again, that's not necessarily a problem. What makes it a problem is that you feel like it wants to do that. And at points it feels like they wrote the plot and they're like, oh yeah, we forgot to put the allegory in, so let's put a little bit in. It's not quite as strong, therefore, and not as powerful in the end of the film. So you don't come away with it with the same feelings that you would if it was evenly balanced. Doing an allegory is very difficult, and I'm not gonna criticize the film too much for it because it's hard, and especially when you're comparing it to the original Gojira, and again, it's not necessary. Again, with a more of a plot and less allegory, it's less of a problem than the reverse thing of more allegory than plot, because movies are about having plots first because It's kind of the point of a movie. It's about telling a story. The themes should be derived from the story. So the fact that there isn't enough allegory is not really a problem. The only problem is that it definitely wants to do that. So when there's not enough of it and it's not as strong, it becomes a quick problem. But again, I would prefer having a good story to having strong allegory. So I'm glad that there is something there. I just wish that it was more comprehensive than it actually is, because I feel like it wants to do that. So I do have to criticize the film for that as well, but what is there is very interesting. I just wish that it was more pronounced. So the allegory is good, just not strong enough to make the film powerful like the original Gojira. So let's talk about the final thing. I guess we'll talk about Godzilla worked into this allegory quickly too. He's still very representative of atomic weapons, just like he was in the original. But he is also almost more direct in this series, especially. I like how we're getting an update on the atomic allegory with Godzilla feeding off nuclear energy. I think that's a good idea, because it's kind of like we get complacent with the use of nuclear energy and we forget how dangerous it really is. So Godzilla comes across and destroys a reactor and shows everyone, oh yeah, wait a minute, what about Fallout and all that stuff? So I really like that, and I think it adds to his nuclear allegory in that he's feeding off the thing that is kind of supporting our modern society, and he's showing us why it's bad. I don't like it only because, well, I like it. I like it a lot. It's just that really my only qualm with it is that we don't really feel the impact of it, especially with this film. There's really no talk about Fallout when Godzilla destroys that reactor, and I wish that was brought up. It makes the film seem a little less comprehensive than it sets out to do. But again, I really like that idea, and it'll be done better in the following films. So I like the idea. I just wish it was more comprehensive. So that's the theme and allegory. I think it's a decent exploration of 1984, the world, the Cold War, and I just wish it was more comprehensive and a little stronger. So I do wish that it was a little stronger, but ultimately I think it's relatively well done. The last two things I want to talk about are the effects and the music. Both of them are awesome. Let's talk about the effects first. The effects for the Return of Godzilla are absolutely astounding. With only having one monster, I feel like they're doing a lot more detail on the suit. Overall, this Godzilla suit is very similar and in a good way to the original suit. And at points, it looks the same. I mean, there are some points where Godzilla bends his head where he gives off that very dragon-like impression that he gave the first time. So, I really like the suit, and it's extremely detailed, extremely lifelike, and overall, it's extremely imposing, just like the original one was. And I almost feel like with a slightly refined face and being in color, obviously, he's almost more intimidating and more scary. And one thing that I really like that's carried over from the original is the eyes. The eyes are never looking straight at what you'd expect him to look at. Like, when Godzilla seems like he's facing the camera, he's not looking at the camera. He seems very dead in expression. And not dead like it looks like a fake suit. Dead like he's unemotional and cold. Like he just doesn't care. Like the original. So I really like the eyes. Overall, the suit helps in the characterization of going back to the original. So I love this Godzilla suit. Overall, though the effects are extremely well done, the miniatures are seamless, and the transitions from actual footage of Tokyo to footage of the miniatures is totally seamless. And when Godzilla destroys the miniatures, it really looks like he's destroying the city. And the integration of live action footage and then special effects footage is totally seamless, and you really get the impression that this is a giant monster destroying a city. So the special effects are absolutely fantastic. The only problem I have with the effects, and this is kind of a widely criticized thing about this film, is the use of animatronics for the first time in Godzilla film history. I think this is the first time they're used. In the original Gojira, there was wide extensive use of a puppet of Godzilla's upper body. And even when I reviewed that film, I said it was very noticeable when it was done. In this film, even more so, because the head looks different. Gojira could get away with it a little bit because this was the first time it was being used in Japan. Sure, this is early for animatronics, but it looks even more unconvincing, and just it doesn't look anything like the suit, and that's it also looks it just, the face looks different and the expression looks different, and it's very clear when it's animatronics and when it's the suit. It does look cool, but it's a little noticeable, so I wish that it was used differently. But I do like the animatronics. It's way too noticeable. So I wish they would have just opted for just using the suit. But if they had to use those up close shots, make them look a little bit more convincing. But it's not really. I can't take points off the film for it because it was one of the first times it was done in Japan. But it looks very noticeable. The last thing I want to talk about is the music. I don't have a lot to say about it, only because I really like it. I mean, it's not entirely Godzilla. Like, it's not very Ifukube or Sato. It's extremely dramatic though and very engaging. So I like the music. It doesn't feel like entirely Godzilla, but it does give this film a very unique tone. And music can oftentimes do that for Godzilla films. We talked about this with Terror of Mechagodzilla. So the music does help in defining Godzilla '84. It just doesn't feel as much like Godzilla as some past stuff has. So it's great and versatile and is able to encapsulate a wide range of emotions and is very dramatic. Just at the end of the day, it doesn't feel entirely like Godzilla music. So I love the music. It's just not entirely Godzilla, but that's, whatever. It gives the film a unique tone. So I really like the music. Let's talk. So with all that said about the Return of Godzilla, it's a great movie, just not entirely memorable. And I feel like, again, as I said this earlier, the only reason I feel like that is that it's a little bit mainstream. The music encapsulates that. The plot, overbearing the allegory, it feels that way. And overall, it feels a little bit too mainstream to do what it's trying to do and go back to the original Gojira. And that does leave it to be a little bit unmemorable. I mean, not unmemorable, just like, I do get repulsed a little bit by that, and overall the film is a little bit like we've been there and kind of done that, but it's still very interesting. It's just when you're looking back on the film, it's a little bit, it kind of all meshes together. There are great aspects about it, and it is fantastic. It's just not groundbreaking. So because it's not groundbreaking, but it is great for what it's trying to be, I'm gonna give The Return of Godzilla a 4 out of 5. It's great, just not the greatest thing ever. It's not very groundbreaking and not entirely memorable, but for what it is, it's fantastic. So I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. So that all about, I do ultimately recommend it. But the Japanese version is only available through Amazon, so I do recommend you go to Amazon and pick up the Japanese DVD. It's going to cost you $20, but it's worth it. This is a great movie. And if you haven't seen the Japanese version, it's different enough where you almost feel like you're watching a new Godzilla movie. So it's worth it for that as well. So again, I'm going to give The Return of Godzilla a 4 out of 5. So that'll about do it for this review of The Return of Godzilla. But we're not quite done with this film yet, since we have to cover the American cut. I don't have a lot to say about it, but because it is very different and because it shoots new scenes, I feel like I would be remiss not to do a separate review, so we're going to do just that. So stay tuned later today for my review of America's re-edit of this film when we get into Godzilla 1985. I'll see you guys a little bit later for that review. Sayonara.